2 to 3 times. That's how much more likely a female footballer is to tear her anterior cruciate ligament or her ACL than a man playing the same sport. But why? Is it hormones, anatomy, strength, technique, or is the answer more complicated than that? Welcome to the Sunday Paper Roundup, where I read the paper so you don't have to. I've just had a delivery. I'm on my box fresh figs. You can actually see the crease is still here. So I haven't had a chance to iron it. Over the last few weeks, we've looked at papers on strength training, longevity, injectables, Achilles tendon, sleep, lifestyle, compression sock. And today we'll come back to my core practice area, knees, and specifically one of the biggest challenges in modern sports medicine, ACL injuries in women's football. Awesome humans wear figs. This week's paper was published in Kester, one of the leading international journals in sports knee surgery and sports medicine, and it comes from a collaboration between researchers in Australia, the USA and China, led by the University of Wollongong and Football Australia. Rather than asking who gets injured, they actually asked something much more useful. What was the player actually doing at the moment the ACL tore? The researchers identified 247 ACL injuries across 25 professional women's football leagues between 2022 and 2024. Video footage was also available for 127 of those injuries. Each video was then analysed frame by frame using a validated method to understand exactly how these injuries occurred. Now, the first thing that caught my attention, most injuries, around 2/3, happen in the first half. Not at all as you'd expect at the end of games when players were exhausted. It was actually much earlier, where you'd perhaps expect fatigue to be less of a factor. I think that's interesting because fatigue is often blamed for ACL injuries. This paper suggests the story may be more complicated than simply saying players get tired and their technique falls apart. Now, of course, first half doesn't necessarily mean that players weren't fatigued, and this study wasn't designed to measure fatigue directly. The second finding was that almost half of the injuries were non-contact. In other words, the ACL, the ligament, failed without another player hitting the knee directly. That's what we see in clinical practice. And another large proportion involved indirect contact, body contact that disrupted balance rather than a direct blow to the knee itself. Again, I think that's really important. When people think about ACL injuries, they often picture a huge collision or coming together, but that's not what this study found, and that's not what we see in practice. Many injuries occur during completely normal football movements, and in Joe Public, the vast majority of ACL injuries are totally non-contact in my experience. And that reinforces why prevention isn't simply about avoiding contact. It's about preparing athletes for the demands and the chaos of sport. The most common situations they saw in video analysis in these female professional athletes: pressing an opponent, making a tackle, or being tackled. These weren't freak accidents, they were common football movements, performed thousands of times every single match. The researchers also looked at body position during injury, and a common pattern emerged, particularly during pressing and tackling. There was moderate bending at the hip, around 50 degrees, but relatively little bending at the knee, only around 24 degrees when the foot first hit the ground, and the knee tended to move inwards, or what we call dynamic valgus. Now, this is where I think it's important not to oversimplify things. Every few years, social media decides there's one thing that causes ACL injuries. At one point, it was the shoes, then it was the pitches, and so on. But human movement simply isn't that simple. ACL injuries are almost certainly multifactorial: anatomy, strength, neuromuscular control, decision-making, the situation, previous injury, the movement itself. This paper identifies common patterns, but it doesn't prove that those patterns actually cause the injury. And that's a really important distinction. What I particularly liked about this paper was its scale. 127 analysed injuries across 25 professional leagues is one of the largest video analyses we've had in women's football. The videos were independently reviewed using a structured, validated framework. That's not easy research to do, and it's hella time consuming. But it adds valuable information to a field where the evidence base is still growing. But of course, no study is perfect. This is descriptive research. It tells us what happened, not why it happened. The researchers were analysing 2-dimensional television footage rather than 3-dimensional laboratory motion caption data, so some biological measurements were inevitably uncertain, and the authors are very open about that, and I actually think that's a strength. Good researchers acknowledge what the data can and can't tell us. So does this actually change what we do? Well, I don't think it changes surgery, and it doesn't change rehabilitation too much, and it certainly doesn't change ACL prevention programs overnight, but it does reinforce where we should be focusing our attention: on football-specific movements, pressing, tackling, cutting, landing, and preparing athletes for the situations they're most likely to encounter during a match. Every study like this adds another piece to the puzzle, and that's exactly how progress in sports medicine happens. Rarely through one landmark paper, but usually through lots of good studies, each adding another piece to the evidence, another brick in the wall. Oh man, it's hot. So what's my verdict? Should we ignore it? Should we keep it in mind when we see patients? Or should we go ahead and change our practice? Well, for me, keep it in mind. This is a high-quality descriptive study using real match footage from professional women's football. It tells us what happened, it can't tell us why it happened, and it certainly can't tell us that changing one movement pattern will prevent ACL injuries. But understanding the problem is always the first step towards solving it. As someone who spends my life reconstructing torn ACLs, and I love it, great fun, but I'd much rather prevent them happening in the first place. Anyway, I'll see you next Sunday. I'll keep breaking down the evidence as it lands. Why do I think I need compression socks? See you next Sunday. Peace! My new fix, covered in new tonic. That is not a good look, bugger.